Hey guys, welcome to another lesson from Ratio Christi at Texas A&M University. I'm your host, Zachary Lawson. Today we are joined by General and Joe in the comments. We'll also be following along we will be following along in the live comments as well on YouTube. So if you have anything to say, be sure to just drop us a line there. Today we'll be talking about the problem of evil. Before we get into that, I think we better go ahead and get to know our panel, at least those that are here. We'll start with General. Do you have anything to say?
Yeah, Zach. Thanks for having me. I'm General Han Solo. You can find my YouTube channel. It's just my name, General Han Solo. I do a lot of stuff on the ancient Near East, integrating the Bible and science. I'm a Christian, a concordist, an Arminian, and I look forward to talking about the problem of evil. I actually have an entire slideshow on my Google Drive, but we're going with yours today. So look forward to exploring that with you.
Okay. Joe, you have anything to say?
Yeah, go to thoughtsinthecar.blogspot.com for more atheist rhetoric.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Joe. All right. So we'll just start here. Let me get the presentation up and going. All right. I'm going to share the screen. All right. Y'all see the presentation?
Yep.
All right, cool. So this one is going to be a lot more discussion-based than the other ones. So we'll just have to participate a little bit more than before. The previous ones I've done most of the work.
Zach, it's not showing up. You want to reshare it?
Sure. Technical difficulties. Okay.
All right, there we go.
Let me present to everyone. That's what the problem is. Okay, there we go. Now is that working?
Yep.
All right, cool. So the topic will be the problem of evil. Dun dun dun. Dr. Evil. So first, I want to start just with a question. What is evil? So, General, you seem to be kind of the most awake in the room right now. So I'll just start with you. What is evil?
Yeah, according to Aristotle, evil is actually the absence of any goodness, because some atheists will say that if God is an omni-God, he's omni-everything, then he should also be omni-evil. But that would assume that evil is itself a substance. But I don't think it is. I think evil is just the absence of good. Maybe we have alternative answers to that. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, there are a lot of different ways to view evil. The way that C.S. Lewis put it which has been pretty informative in the philosophical discussions for the past 50 years or so, is that he said that it's not so much a problem of evil as much as it is a problem of suffering or a problem of pain. And you could almost reduce evil down to just the phenomenological experience of, unpleasant qualia, if you want to use a bunch of philosophical $10 words. So in some of the discussion, we could just equivocate on evil and suffering back and forth. Did you have something else to add, General?
Nope.
Oh, okay. Joe, did I hear you saying something?
No, you didn't.
Okay. So for those of us that are, or those of y'all that are in the audience there, if you just have a second, just kind of take a minute and reflect on what you think that evil is and what you mean whenever you talk about evil.
Yeah, I guess in the context of the problem of evil, we might think of things like you said, just suffering. Like people who are suffering would be thought of as a sort of natural evil. Maybe that would be, well, depending on what influenced them to be suffering, because you have this distinction between natural evil and moral evil. Uh, Natural evil would be like a tsunami hits your village, and we might say, how could God allow that kind of thing? And that would be a little different from if some immoral person does something that causes you to suffer. So, yeah, I guess that there would be nuances within evil.
Okay. All right, cool. All right, so we'll move on to the next question. So now that we more or less have an idea of what we mean when we talk about evil, what actually is the problem with evil? And there are different ways that you can split this up. The way that I'd like to split it up here is between the intellectual problem of evil and the existential problem of evil, or sometimes called the emotional problem of evil. And it's important to make this distinction because the answers that you give to the intellectual problem of evil are not going to be the same kind of answers that you would give to the emotional or existential problem of evil. So the intellectual problem of evil would be the idea of there appears to be some formal logical inconsistency between the existence of evil in the world and the existence of an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God. So this is all mental puzzle that you need to solve, that you've got these two things that appear to be at minimum in tension with each other and possibly even formally contradictory with each other. And there have been many ways that you could go about putting syllogisms up on, or not syllogism, but anyway, putting like logical premises up on a board and trying to derive some sort of formal consistency between these two things. And that is very much different from the existential or emotional problem of evil. Because the emotional problem of evil is something that has to deal with each individual person's own experience with evil in their own life, whether it's their own experience of suffering or their own experience of pain or unfairness or evil or any variety of things. Anything that would cause a person to cry out to God and ask, why? Why are you doing this to me? That is something that would fit within the existential problem of evil. So if you can imagine that, I'm sure that many of you that have gone through times of pain have probably heard people give you examples of solutions to the existential problem of evil. And you may have even gotten in a few debates in the dorm room where you've heard some solutions to the intellectual problem of evil. So if you just kind of think off the top of your head about the types of answers that you would give to these problems, you can realize that if you give a formal mathematical proof to someone who is experiencing pain and asking, why would God allow this? And you pull out your chalkboard and you say, well, actually, if you start with this premise here, they're going to consider that to be distant, to be cold, to be unloving, and just nothing about that engages with the pain that they're experiencing. But if you try to reach out in love and gentleness to say, I'm here for you and I can help you, but you're talking to a philosophy professor that has posed a legitimate problem for you, he's going to consider those answers to be vague. They're not going anywhere to actually solve the problem. So it's important that you provide existential solutions to existential problems and formal solutions to formal problems. All right. Any comments so far on this distinction?
Yeah. What's interesting about the existential problem of evil is that we actually see that in the Psalms, because there are Psalms of lamentation where you see this deep recess of human emotion. People are crying out to God. They lost their homeland. The Jews were overtaken by the Babylonians. And we see people crying out and asking, why did God allow this? David is being pursued by Saul. He has enemies all around him. And he is going through all of that, but still he kept his faith in God. So yeah, I think we see examples of the existential problem in the Bible. Something else we could think about is the fact that people have different personalities. So even if somebody is in pain, there could be a certain personality type that would respond better to intellectual responses to the problem of evil rather than, I love you, I'm here for you. I mean, I think that would have its place too in that sort of dialogue. But depending on the person and what kind of response they would react to, sometimes they would prefer the intellectual response because it would show them that it really was just an emotional problem. But It really depends on the person.
Okay. Yeah. That's a really good point. I think also to give another biblical example, the example of Christ himself on the cross crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" in his deepest moment of trial. That for me has always been kind of a go-to whenever I've been under significant amount of pain and suffering in my own life. I think the fact that we can turn to the Son of God himself and realize that God, he who did not spare his own son, but gave him on our behalf, that Christ himself, the God-man, God incarnate, actually has experienced that evil. I think that right there has the grounds for a good solution to the existential problem.
That's true. Actually, I recently read a blog called Thoughts in the Car, .blogspot.com, and the author really hits on the existential problem of evil in a very personal way. And yet you could see that the author still has faith in God, even though he might be suffering from or has suffered with the existential problem of evil.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you could even go so far to build kind of a bit of a parody to say that even Jesus in his deepest trials and the greatest experiences of pain that he had, he never doubted his own existence.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. All right, we just got a new guest here, so hey, General, what are you doing? What's up?
Hey guys.
Hi. We're talking about the problem of evil, so whenever you want, you can jump in. All right, so again, just to summarize, intellectual problem, existential problem, they are two sides of the coin of evil. So it's important to not mix up the answers to that, because if you go to your philosophy professor and say, well, Jesus died on the cross and cried out to God, he's not going to say that solves the logical problem. All right, so let's move on. So now that we've divided those two problems, we need to go a little bit further, and I think something that's important to realize is that evil is not something that is a problem just for Christians, or even just for theists in general. It's actually a problem for all moral realists out there. If you truly believe that there is evil in the world, your philosophy or worldview or what have you, you need to have some sort of explanation or some sort of, maybe not necessarily a solution to it, but you need to have something in your worldview that accounts for evil. The alternative would be you would just have to be more or less you'd either have to say there is no evil in the world, which I think is really very unlikely, or you would have to say that morality is something that isn't real. It's something that's more or less illusory. So for those of us that are theists, Christians, or atheistic moral realists, we need to have room in our worldviews to account for evil. So the point of that is just to say that if you are someone who's not a theist and you use the problem of evil as an argument against God, that doesn't actually solve the problem completely, because you still have to have your own kind of accounting with it. So in other words, to put it succinctly, evil is something that's a problem for everyone, that everyone has to wrestle with it and has to put it in their own worldview. For Christians and theists, there's a particular problem because some people have claimed that there's a contradiction between evil and the foundation of theistic belief, namely the existence of God. So let's go a little bit more detail in some other types of problems of evil. We've already discussed the existential versus logical problem of evil. That's the same thing as the emotional versus intellectual. We've also have internal and external evil, so that's just evil that's within yourself, and external. That one's not so interesting. General talked about this earlier, the difference between moral and natural evil. So this would be the difference between your best friend is killed by a murderer, that would be moral evil, or your best friend is killed in an earthquake. That would be an example of natural evil. And then lastly, we have the logical and probabilistic versions of the problem of evil. And I have this little scale down here to kind of give you an idea. if you're saying that there is a logical problem of evil, I know I've kind of equivocated on this back and forth, on this logical thing, but in this context, a logical problem of evil means there is a formal logical contradiction between the statements evil exists in the world and God exists. Those are formally contradictory. To say evil and God exist is like saying a married bachelor or a four-sided triangle or something to that effect. It is logically impossible that those two things are co-actualized. Then, if anything less than that is what's called a probabilistic problem of evil, which just simply says that given theism, it's extremely unlikely that we would see any type of evil in the world. So the fact that we do see evil in the world makes the existence of God very unlikely. And that's kind of the idea. So if you're over here, you would say that there's a logical contradiction between evil and God, and then there are varying degrees of certainty about how unlikely the existence of God, the coexistence of God and evil are. And then over here, you're just 50-50. It can go either way. So, so yeah. So I think that helps. Any questions about terminology so far?
Yeah. What is internal and external again?
So that won't be all that important here, but the basic idea is just the evil that you experience internal to your own self and the evil that's outside of you. So I guess you could say in that deal, it's sort of like the issue of what do we do with racism in America? That's an external problem because that's something that it's not something that's inside of you, but I mean, it occurs outside in the world. It's a phenomenon that is outside of yourself that needs to be fixed. Although there are elements that are internal, of course, you know, like being a racist. That would be an example of something that's internal that you have to deal with. So, but that's not really all that important.
Well, I don't know, Zach. I think you could use that internal problem of evil to discuss the external. Like if you're talking about racism in America or corrupt government or something like that, you could kind of turn it inward when you're having a discussion with an atheist or something, and ask them, well, aren't you in this sort of position too?
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Hey, I'm getting a bit of an echo from somebody. Okay, thanks. All right. So here's a great example. This is the paradigm example of natural evil. Because as I'm sure many of you have already been kind of ruminating about this issue, a couple of solutions have come to mind.
Wait, there's a guy named William Rowe.
Yeah, William Rowe.
Oh wow.
He's a famous atheist.
That's funny because my name is actually Rowe.
Oh. Okay. Not relevant, but okay, that's interesting. So William Rowe, he was one of the leading defenders of the argument from evil, atheistic defenders. He was pretty popular in the 60s, and one of the biggest contributions that he made was this example, which is called the burning fawn. So I know this is a long block of text, but I think it's important that we read all of it. So this is his paper, The Problem of Evil and Some Varieties of Atheism, and this is the relevant section. Suppose that in some distant forest, lightning strikes a dead tree, resulting in a forest fire. In the fire, a fawn is trapped, horribly burned, and lies in terrible agony for several days before death finally relieves its suffering. So far as we can see, the fawn's intense suffering is completely pointless, for there does not appear to be any greater good such that the prevention of the fawn's suffering would require either the loss of that good or the occurrence of an evil that is equally bad or worse. Nor does it seem to be any equally bad or worse evil so connected to the fawn's suffering that it would have had to occur had the fawn's suffering been prevented. So could an omnipotent, omniscient being have prevented the fawn's apparently suffering or apparent pointless suffering? The answer is obvious. Even the theist will insist this. an omnipotent, omniscient being could have easily prevented the fawn from being horribly burned, or, given the burning, could have even spared the fawn the intense suffering by quickly ending its life, rather than allowing the fawn to lie in terrible agony for several days. Since the fawn's intense suffering was preventable, and, as far as we can see, pointless, doesn't it appear that there do exist instances of intense suffering which an omnipotent, omniscient being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse? So, in summary, this fawn gets burned alive over several days before it finally dies in the middle of a forest. No humans are around, no other animals are around, nothing. It seems Rowe is arguing that this intense suffering is utterly pointless, and an omnipotent, omniscient being could have easily prevented that pointless suffering. And so this seems to be very inconsistent on theism. Any immediate responses?
I think this might be an assessment of theism, but I don't think it would apply to Christian theism, because we have a response to that built in, don't we? We have this idea of our idea of the fall of man, bringing sin into the world and therefore corrupting the earth, bringing or resulting in death and suffering, suffering of animals even. So this world was made for sinful creatures, and in a world made for sinful creatures, you'll see animal death. It's to be contrasted against the perfect world that God will bring about at the end of ages, which will have no sin. So I think the reason that the world is the way it is that, as Genesis tells us, that the ground is cursed.
Okay. We can get into the specifics here in a bit on that. There's a lot to interact with your response, but I'll save that for a little bit later. Okay.
Maybe General wants to respond.
Okay. Well, I'll have an open discussion section here in a bit, so we can get into more detail there. Okay, so here's the basic argument, which this was probably most famously put together by Epicurus a long time ago. Basically, the Christianity claims what's called a three omni God. That means that God is all powerful, all good, and all knowing. And all of those together would entail that there shouldn't be any evil. Because if God is all powerful, he could end evil. And if he's all good, he would want to end evil. If he's all knowing, he would know how to end evil. So Christianity then, by claiming both the existence of evil and the existence of a three omni God, is internally contradictory. So here's kind of the formal argument here. God is omnipotent, all good, all knowing, evil exists. But there's actually this set right here of four statements isn't in fact contradictory, or at least not formally contradictory. You need another premise in there to actually entail that evil does not exist. So here's one. God is all good, all knowing, all powerful. Good things will always eliminate evil. So it would seem then on that case that if that's true, then evil shouldn't exist. So what do you think about that? Do you think that it's true that good things will always eliminate evil?
Not necessarily. We can think of, even on our level, circumstances where you might be a good person, where you would have to concede and allow something evil to happen because you are in immovable circumstances. The classical example for the Christian theist, at least, would be free will, where God puts himself in these circumstances where he won't interfere with their will. So on the human level, we can see how that wouldn't hold true. And I think even if you put the omnipotence there, it might not hold true either if you have the free will defense.
Okay. We just had a new guest join us, Patient Grasshopper. Do you have anything that, or would you like to first introduce yourself and then provide commentary? Hey, patient, your mic's muted.
Hold on. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah, go ahead and
Okay.
introduce yourself real quick. And then
Yeah. Or Ben as. Yeah, I just came here, and I won't be able to stay very long because I've got something else going on. But so this basically saying these are contradictory.
Okay.
Well, not necessarily. You were bringing up free will.
What we're discussing right now is there's a claim that these first four statements right here are contradictory, but in fact, there's nothing about these three statements that entails that even. So what we're doing is we're evaluating candidates that statements that if they're combined with these three will contradict. So what we're asking right now is it true that good things will always eliminate evil?
The fifth one. That's the assumption it's not true. That's one of the ones that's an assumption that's not true.
Okay.
I mean, but the question is, why would someone assume that to be true? I mean, is there something intrinsic in it that would prove that good has to eliminate evil?
I mean, it seems reasonable on the face of it.
That one, then all four of them can go together without a contradiction.
Yeah. Okay. Oh yeah. Well. Okay. Yeah. So I think you raised a good point. And General also made a good point too.
Of God sort of being.
Yeah. So I think we've made some pretty good points about this fifth one being false. That even on the human level.
Basically, I'd say that the number 5 point is basically.
Yeah. Hey, patient, you're kind of cutting out a little bit.
Retro Christi, you can actually mute his mic.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've already gone over this aspect.
Hey, patient, I'm gonna have to mute you for a second, just because you're cutting in and out. Your mic seems to be a little inconsistent there. So if you'll just look at it and see if you can figure out what's going on there. So I think we've provided some pretty good counterexamples to this fifth one. Even on the human level, sometimes we have to allow for evil things to happen, even though we may be good or trying to do the good thing. All right, so that one won't work. Let's try another one. How about this? God's all good, all-knowing, all-powerful, and all good, all-powerful, all-knowing beings always eliminate every evil that it can eliminate without either bringing about a greater evil or eliminating a greater good. What do we think about this one?
Yeah.
In other words, to put it another way, the only time an evil is eliminated is whenever well, hold on, let me try this again. Evil is only permitted because it's either bringing about a greater good or it's preventing an even greater evil. That's what I'm trying to say. Okay. General, you had something?
I think it would take us back to the free will defense. I guess I can expand on that a little because I think the free will thing would resolve that too. But I think God has set up a two-world system where he wants to give his people all of the possible goods. And this two-world system would be a perfect world, what we'll have in the new heavens and the new earth, and an imperfect world, what we have now. And only when you have this two-world system can you give people all of the possible goods. So in an imperfect world, you could have goods like courage, self-sacrifice, and free will. But in the perfect world, you'll have abundantly more goods, but still, if God wants to give his creatures all of the possible goods, then he would have to create an imperfect world with evil and suffering. So I think that would challenge that point that we just brought up, that that would be the only circumstance in which evil would be permitted, because I could think of at least that, and probably maybe a few others.
Okay, yeah, that's getting a little bit in front of where we're going. So I won't respond to everything. Yeah, I think you're right there. That whatever answer we have, typically it has to deal with, you know, the evil that's here is not purposeless. Would that be a pretty accurate summary of what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. I don't want to get too ahead, but I think for this to work, you would have to prove that it was gratuitous evil. But
yep.
as Christians, we don't believe in gratuitous evil.
Exactly. Yep. And that is the exact conclusion here that we're coming to. So here's our formal argument right here. Premise 1, God exists. Premise 2, God is omnipotent, all good and all knowing. Next, all good, all powerful, all knowing beings always eliminate every evil that it can eliminate that doesn't either A, bring about a greater evil, or eliminate a greater good. So the conclusion of that is that no instance of evil exists that can be eliminated without causing greater evil or eliminating greater good. Or to put it another way, there's no gratuitous evil. So I think, yeah, we're about to get into the discussion section here. So just to summarize where we've gone so far, we've said that there appears to be a contradiction between the existence of God and the existence of evil. But whenever we've teased apart the argument, what we found out is that the contradiction appears to be between a three omni God and what's called gratuitous evil or purposeless evil. So that means that now, if we are to solve the problem of evil, we have to answer the question, what is this greater good that God is allowing all this evil in the world for? What things are sufficient reasons that God would allow this arena of, you know, death, suffering, and pain that we experience in life? And I like this particular answer from the Saturday Morning Breakfast cartoon. Priest and the Fellow. For those that are on audio only, we've got a geek fellow that's talking to a priest. He asks, if God's all good, all knowing, and all powerful, how can there be evil? And the priest replies, well, if there were no evil in the world, then there would be no Batman. And that appears to be one potential solution.
I know that's a joke, but I actually agree with that. Maybe not the Batman part, but maybe not well, obviously not Batman, but in the sense that if there is no evil in the world, then there's no heresy, and heresy is a good. Courage is a good, and God set up these conditions so we could enjoy those things, things that we couldn't have in heaven. Yeah. So yeah, it may be a little facetious, but if Batman's parents weren't murdered in that alley, then there would be no Batman. So that's potential kind of a joke. One last piece of vocabulary before we go into open discussion: defense versus theodicy. So a defense is a much more, well, let's start with theodicy. The theodicy is kind of the holy grail of Christianity, because, oh, no, come on, not a single chuckle? Okay, fine. Anyway, a theodicy is kind of that's the goal of this entire project. This right here, it's a plausible reason for why God allows all the evil in the world that is coherent with his own existence and his own purposes. The key word there is something that is plausible or probable, that this actually could be the reason that God had in mind for why he allows the evil in the world. That's a theodicy. Now, a defense is something that is a lot less ambitious than that. The theodicy is a piece of truth that is hidden in the divine mind. So for us to reason to that and to actually get this idea would be quite an achievement. A defense is merely a proposal. It's a logically possible state of affairs that includes God and evil,
just to show that those two things are compatible with each other. But it doesn't necessarily have to be true. All you have to do is say, I can't know exactly what God had in mind. But what I do know is that this state of affairs that I've described has both God existing and evil existing. And since it's logically possible, that proves that there is, in fact, no contradiction between the statement God exists and evil exists. So basically, if you start with a defense, the more probable that it is, the closer it gets to being a theodicy. So if you have a really, really plausible, highly probable defense, then you've got a pretty good working theodicy. So that's the last little piece of vocabulary. And now we'll get into some actual discussion. So I'm going to ask you now, this is for everyone, why? Why is there so much evil in the world?
Zach, maybe a preliminary question. I wonder if this notion of greater good, if that would restrict us to a consequentialist ethic, like the idea that the ends will ultimately justify the means. Do you think that's related?
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. That's one of the chief that's a chief complaint that's often raised against this kind of thinking. And I don't think that's necessarily the case, because you could look at it from another point of view, which is to say that there are some things that have natural corollaries to them. There are certain goods that have natural corollaries. So one example may be that if you have an engine, the natural corollary is that it's going to give off heat.
That's what I was thinking when he's.
Yeah, because that's the nature of the engine is such that you can't have it without any sort of heat transfer. So it could be the case that it's not necessarily consequentialist if you just say that, this is something I'm going to do, but it's the ramifications of it, or the corollaries of it, are, they're inescapable.
Yeah.
But so that might be a way of looking at it.
Sorry, Ben, you were giving off feedback and I muted you. I didn't realize you were going to start talking. You want to come in now? Hey, Joseph, you there?
Nah.
Joe, why do you suppose there's evil and suffering in the world? If you can give a serious answer.
Because, well, this is probably a low-G response, but because ultimately it glorifies God more when good wins, or in the sense God wins.
Oh, that's actually a good point. So God having victory over evil would glorify him more than God just existing with his people or something like that, where he doesn't actually have victory. We wouldn't be able to proclaim the victory is the Lord's. That's actually a good point. Yeah, like we wouldn't have these inspiring verses in the Bible, like the battle is the Lord's. When David defeated Goliath, well, we wouldn't have these underdog narratives where the little guy defeats the big guy by God's power. So that could be one thing. I also wonder how much the book of Job would relate to our discussion, because throughout this narrative in Job, he's suffering through all this stuff. He lost his family, his home, and all of his friends are telling him, you must have done something wrong. And Job is just saying, no, I know I didn't do anything wrong. And in a sense, he's right. But then toward the end of the narrative, he began questioning God and saying, God, I know I haven't done anything wrong, so why have you brought this upon me? And he actually got an answer. Like, unlike most people who cry out, why is this happening to me? Job actually got an answer. But it wasn't the answer that he wanted. God said, who are you who darkens the counsel of wisdom by words without knowledge? And then he went on to pose like 300 hypothetical questions that he knew that Job wouldn't be able to answer. Like, where were you when I created this and this? Which all of which is essentially to say that Job, you don't know anything, and that would go to Zachary's point about the defense rather than the theodicy, because there is this state of affairs that exists in the real world where God allows or even brings about evil things, because we saw in the first chapter of Job that God actually brought it about or commanded someone else to. And Job doesn't understand the mind of God. He can't do divine psychology and say God is mistreating me, because God could have good reasons that we're just not aware of. And I think that's the entire premise of the Book of Job. This notion that God has good reasons that we're just not aware of. I see General's back. How's it going, General? You there?
Yeah, if I was there, if I was in Job's shoes, I think God would trigger me to write up an 888-page PowerPoint slide and answer his questions.
Right. Yeah, that's actually this might be a sidebar, but it's interesting that a lot of those questions might be able to be answered today. So he might change the questions if asked in the modern context. Like, he might ask you about intricacies of the quantum vacuum or something like that.
Did you guys discuss the divine counsel context in regards to the sufferings of Job?
We haven't gotten that far into the weeds yet. But before we do, we have a couple of questions in the YouTube chat. So I'd like to respond to those. So here's the first one. Clarification on the gratuitous evil thing. It says, so are you saying that all evil that befalls a person is for a divine purpose? I see that evil happens, such as disease and disaster, because we are fallen creatures living in a fallen world. When a person takes the, quote, everything happens for a divine reason belief, it puts on the person not only the burden of dealing with the evil, but also having to figure out the why. Any thoughts to that? The first thing that I wanted to clarify is that what we're saying is that the evil that happens in the world is not kind of like the Sunday school, well, everything happens for a reason. It's saying that the alternative would be that God created a world that has purposeless evil in it, that God knew that this thing was going to happen. It served absolutely no purpose in the world other than to increase suffering with no benefit, and it could have been completely gone forever. Think back to William Rowe's example of the fawn. That's supposed to be the paradigm example. This fawn was burning alive and then spent several days in agonizing pain, unable to move, hardly able to breathe, and all alone. It doesn't appear to serve any purpose. But that appears to be gratuitous evil, and we have to ask ourselves, why in the world would God allow that? Because that seems purposeless. So whenever we say that that there's no gratuitous evil, what we're saying is that it could be the case that the evils that you experience, they may not be the Sunday school, everything happens for a reason, so this is going to help you personally later on in life. It could be that this is something that's built into the fabric of the universe that's like a natural corollary kind of a thing. It's like almost like saying the example of the engine. If you have an engine, you have to have a heat transfer system, otherwise it'll overheat. The heat's something that's not necessarily desirable, but it's something that's naturally there. So if you live in a world like Richard was saying earlier, that it obeys the certain laws of physics that we have, and we have the certain genetic mutations that we have, for example, or we have the certain makeups that we do, then whenever I put my hand on a stove, it's going to hurt. Or that's just that's the natural outworking of the way that the universe is built. Because in order for me to touch a stove and my hand not to hurt, there would have to be other things leading up to that that would be bad. I would have to either have no nerve sensation, which would be bad, or entropy would have to, the laws of entropy would have to change, and that's also bad.
Yeah,
So
so
that's the idea.
So
Can I add something? Oh wait, does General want to say something?
General, go ahead.
All right, thanks. Yeah, I'm actually. I don't know if you guys know about hidden treasures in the Book of Job. Have you heard of that one?
Yeah, I've heard of it. I've actually
Have you-
done a video series on my YouTube channel, General Han Solo, so you guys can check that out.
Okay. On page 50 and 51, I think he says some brilliant things in light of what Rashi Christi is getting at. But I'm just wondering, is this purely a philosophical discussion, or can I add some science into this?
Yeah, you can add a little bit of science. But the general idea is still mostly philosophical.
Okay. Then I don't know if this will help, but Hero, I'll just skim read and see what Hero says. He says, often people are tempted to blame Satan for all the hurricanes, tornadoes, volcanoes, earthquakes, fires, floods, droughts that bring pain and loss to themselves or others. Many even cite the first 2 chapters of Job as proof of Satan's culpability. And then he goes down and says that, for example, why must we endure hurricanes? So in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina and other massive storms, and one wonders why God would subject the planet to such forces. Given the laws of physics the Creator used in shaping the universe, the absence of such storms would mean either less rainfall, less evenly distributed rainfall, lower quality living space on the continents, or more extreme day-to-night temperature differences. And then he goes on to explain how lightning actually plays a critical role. Where is it? Oh yeah, he says here, lightning also generates wildfires, which remove growth inhibitors, infuse soils with water-retaining and mineral-rich charcoal, and facilitate the growth of arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, a vital nitrogen fixator for vascular plants. And apparently, if you guys have seen those NASA videos of the time lapse of the International Space Station going over the planet, and you see lightning strikes everywhere, they've actually done tests on that where is at an optimal level, even though we know there's something evil going on, like someone could be getting hurt, there could be a wildfire starting, who knows what's going on, but you need that optimal rate in order for the planet to thrive. So I don't know how you guys will
Yeah, that's actually I'm getting an echo. Okay, it's gone now. Yeah, that's actually a good point, because that actually gives specific scientific answers to natural evil, and I think that's a good thing for us to research. So Hugh Ross's The Hidden Treasures of the Book of Job, anyone in the audience should check that one out if that's something you struggle with. Kind of building on Zach's response to the audience question that we have to deal with this issue of figuring out why. I don't think you do. I think as a believer, as a faithful Christian, you could just throw up your hands and say, I've put my trust in God. My hope is in Him. I don't know all the reasons, but I believe that He does. So that would be kind of the existential side of the logical response, that we don't believe in gratuitous evil because we just trust in God, and know that He has a purpose for it, even if we will never know what it is.
Yeah. Another way of phrasing that would be to say that we probably need to go back and question if we should even expect to have an answer in the first place as to why there is evil in the world. Another way, because if you think about it, if we're correct, if we as Christians are correct, that the evil in the world that exists is due to some reason that was determined by an omnipotent being. It seems unreasonable to think, or sorry, omniscient and omnipotent being. It seems unreasonable to think that we as human beings, with our limited both cognitive abilities and cognitive frameworks, would ever possibly be able to discern what those purposes are. Even if you look back at history, you can see that there are major events that came about because of some extremely small event that happened way far back in the distant past. You can think of the butterfly effect almost. And so for people that, let's take a butterfly effect type of event and say that the people that saw that event at the time of its occurrence would have no reason to believe that that small event that they saw would ultimately result in some greater effect way down the line, maybe even thousands of years after the fact. So likewise, it seems to us that it seems to me that, you know, why should we as human beings, with our limited cognitive abilities and our limited 70 or so years on the earth to gather information, why would we expect ourselves to be able to discern what ultimate purpose there is for all the evil that's in the universe, especially every particular evil that occurs in the universe? So the formal name for this line of defense is what's called skeptical theism, which is just to say that you're skeptical of your own cognitive ability to discern what the purpose of the evil may serve in the larger role of things. Do y'all have
also,
any?
what about things like, because sometimes I self-reflect on you know, things like very rarely, but it does happen. If say I kind of zone out when I'm driving, and then I suddenly, it's like as if you wake up, but you know you've like reached your destination, and you realize, hang on a second, who was driving? If there was a car crash or something, and then you start hearing stories like, you know, Paul Walker, and 1 minute he's all happy and talking, and then the next minute he's blown up in flames and he dies. It's like that. It's like, you know, you're so close to that person, or it could happen to you. It could happen to me. At any given, it's like pure randomness, really. It's like chaos, the chaos theory. And yet, would you consider that to be some form of agency by a divine hand? It maybe God not directly causing that, but it's sustaining the system that does that, or do you think it's just, you know, you flip a coin and it's, you know, what happens and God will take care of the rest, sort of thing?
I actually think we have I think we have some scripture from the Lord, from Christ's own words on this one. I'm trying to get the exact reference here. I believe it's in Luke chapter 13. Yes, it's in Luke chapter 13. He is talking to the he's talking to the people there in Galilee, and he's talking about this example. It's in Luke 13, 1 through 5. He says, it says there were some present at that very time who had told him about the Galileans, whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. And Jesus answered them, "Do you think that these Galileans were worse sinners than all of the other Galileans because they suffered in this way? No, I tell you, but unless you repent, you all likewise perish." And now look at the example he gives here. What about those 18 on whom the tower in Siloam fell and killed them? Do you think that they were worse offenders than all the others who lived in Jerusalem? No, I tell you, but unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. And I think the example here that he's drawing on is he's pointing to this construction disaster that, you know, killed 18 workers because this tower in Siloam fell. And I think his point was saying that this is something that just naturally occurs, and it could, and like you were just saying, it could happen to anyone at any time. And he says specifically, those people were not sinners any worse than anyone else, and their fate is exactly the same to all of us, to all of ourselves.
Oh, I see. And just sorry to butt in, but is that what James White was getting at? That this is indeed a story, like a metaphor, and it's not an actual, like Jesus is actually saying that there is such a thing as true chaos, like in a mathematical sense, there's true chaos in this.
Well, okay, so this is controversial. So Kirk McGregor is a fellow that very interesting guy, and he wrote a paper called "The Coexistence of God and Genuinely Gratuitous Evil," and he used this example. He said that this particular passage proves that there are examples of gratuitous evil that are in the world, and I don't think that that's the case. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think what Jesus is simply preaching here is what you were just saying, that life is something that could be gone in an instant. And from your epistemic framework, there's no reason to think that you actually have tomorrow. And that is why today is the day of repentance.
Right, but exactly, which is also, I think, what James gets at as well, right? In James chapter 4, and
yeah. I think a lot.
It's just, I guess when I ask a question, it's like it's interesting to hear responses, because it's sort of what I've been concluding as well. But the point is, it's kind of like that. At the same time, it's like that anxiety that that's the case. I'm not saying I wish it wasn't the case. It's just one of those. It's kind of like finding the theory of everything. That type of feeling. It's like realizing, wow, like this is it. You know, it really causes you to self-reflect on how fragile everything actually is, and consider the boasting of those who boast about all their wealth and strength and, you know, all that stuff is nothing compared to what can actually happen to this entire planet. You know, like those sorts of things then start to you take stock of the reality of things, and you know, it's kind of like you're not sticking your head in the sand anymore, sort of feeling.
Yeah, I agree. I think generally you're echoing a little. I think a lot of things can seem random from our perspective, and that can be kind of confusing, especially in theological discussions. But they're not truly random. Like the Bible says that the Lord even directs the roll of the dice. So I don't think it's totally random in that sense. But you know, this the story of the collapse of these towers and the 18 people killed, it's pretty easy to relate that to a modern context. Like when we see terrible things happening throughout the world, we can know that we can kind of apply these stories. Like I remember a few years ago on the anniversary of 9/11, I can't remember the exact details, but there was a terrible tragedy where several Muslims were killed because of a building collapse or something like that on the anniversary of 9/11. And this passage immediately came to mind, because it's like it didn't happen because they're greater sinners than we are. It's just a part of life. People die, and that can be taken as kind of random, but in an ultimate sense, it's not. Even though they're not being that sort of death wouldn't be necessarily a punishment, it would just be what happens in this world. That might be a tangent, but yeah.
No, I appreciate that, General. That's a good reflection on, because even the 9/11 thing, recently I got infatuated by just saying, you know, you can see it, just true randomness, like obviously chaos in the fearful sense, like this chaos of people like screaming and running, but just down to the sometimes I think about the very molecule of fumes that happen to be flying out at a certain direction and with a certain, probably a vector force in this direction with the wind, and where the plane hit, at what angle, and then the structure itself, how it starts to collapse at a certain rate of speed and so on. And I think to myself, all of that, pure physics, can be determined.
Yeah.
Can actually do calculations, predictions. And yet there's like an eternal soul, or thousands of them within those towers that just perish in that instant. Yeah, it's just one of those freaky facts of life, I guess.
To clarify, I wasn't actually talking about 9/11. I was talking about something that happened on the anniversary of 9/11 a few years ago.
No, I understand. Yeah,
Okay.
But it can still apply to that as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Maybe Joe wants to jump in.
Well, I don't have anything. I don't really have anything new to add.
Well, give us something old.
Well, something happened recently on the anniversary of 9/11.
Yeah. One thing I do want to discuss with this idea of skeptical theism. Actually, I have a slide on that, so let me skip ahead to that. So skeptical theism is the idea that we, given our cognitive limitations, and what so this fellow Stephen Wickstra, I think is his name, came up with this idea of cornea, conditions on reasonable epistemic access. The idea there being, is it reasonable to think, given our epistemic access to the world, both in scope and in time, the amount of world that we know and the amount of time that we have access to, is it reasonable to think that we are in an epistemic position to access God's reasons for permitting evil? That's, to me, I actually find this persuasive on one level, but I want to hear your thoughts. Something that kind of makes me skeptical of skeptical theism is it may prove too much. I could easily hear an atheist coming back on this and saying something to the effect of, we may not be in a reasonable epistemic position to judge the evidence for the existence of God. It could be that, this very small amount of information that we can collect over this very small lifetime that we have is not sufficient. And it could be that 200, 300, or 400 years from now, new evidence emerges that completely contradicts and overrides everything that we know. So it's not reasonable to think that we're in an epistemic position to actually address the existence of God himself. And this presumably would be using the exact same reasoning behind our own skepticism of accessing God's reasons for allowing evil. So what do you all think of that?
Yeah, Zach, I have actually heard atheists say this kind of thing before, and I've never found it compelling because obviously when we're talking about scientific evidence or philosophy, there could always be a new idea or a new scientific idea. But the thing is, what we can say about the evidence is that based on the current stream of scientific or historical evidence or philosophy, we can say that based on that, we have good reason to believe in God. So I don't think we can just appeal to something in the future. Like, for example, if you're arguing about, say, evolution, you wouldn't be able to say, well, maybe something in the future could override our scientific conclusions. To which the other party would just respond, okay, I'll wait until that happens. And I don't see why it'd be unreasonable for us to just say that. But the thing is, something else related to that is that our belief in God isn't based on probabilistic evidence. So I wouldn't. So for those two reasons, I wouldn't be overly worried about that. Maybe I missed something. Maybe you want to clarify, or I got something wrong.
Well, maybe the idea is that it almost seems ad hoc to just say, well, this really tough question for Christianity, actually, as it turns out, it's inscrutable. There's no way to actually be in a reasonable epistemic position to actually make a judgment one way or the other. Who can know the mind of God?
Yeah.
Well, the question there is, I mean, where do you draw the line?
Right.
Right.
Yeah. I get.
At what is an atheist epistemically? Is he being epistemically responsible whenever he says that I think evil provides good evidence against the existence of God?
Yeah. Okay. So.
I don't think so.
Okay. So what I think is that when.
Hey, General, hold on. You said a lot. I want to hear from General.
All right.
Yeah, I don't think so. No.
Okay, I regret giving him that time. Continue, General.
All right. Well, what I think is that when the atheist says that that the evil in the world does that, they are actually doing this divine psychology. They are saying that they know that there couldn't be reasons for providing reasons for allowing or causing evil in the world. On the other hand, in contrast, when we do apologetics, we are saying that there is evidence. We're not saying we may discover it. The atheist is saying we may discover some reason in the future or something like that God is permitting evil. So I don't think it's a good contrast there, because we're basing it on the current stream of evidence, and the atheist is basing that argument on the lack of knowledge of God's divine mind, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see where you're going with that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, Rashi, Christi, I think this is an excellent discussion, excellent presentation.
Oh, thanks. Appreciate it.
It's all right.
Surprising me with I honestly think this channel needs to be presented to everyone, even the GDC. I'll probably also put on my channel. Like I won't copy and paste this. I'll more like make a like an intro video or something.
Yeah, I think I will also make an intro video on my General Han Solo channel. Yeah.
Okay.
I'd also like to take this presentation from my General Han Solo Google Drive. So.
Oh yeah. By the way, if, for those of you watching, if you look in the description of this video, I posted the link to the Ratio Christi Google Drive, which is sponsored by the General Han Solo Google Drive, and you can find the slides that I'm going through in the description below. See. There are two other things that I wanted to talk about. One would be the free will defense, and then the second one is I want to talk a little bit about Job specifically. So we'll stick with the pure philosophy, and then we'll get to a little bit of biblical discussions. Yeah. All right. So I want to talk about this one particularly because this is probably the most commonly used and most commonly abused defense whenever it comes to these types of arguments. A lot of times, so I have this idea of like the dorm room argument, where you've got a couple of college freshmen that they're arguing about these kinds of things, and everything that they argue about is just real, blasé type of stuff. And you may have like a generic atheist and a generic Christian arguing about it, and the generic atheist says, well, what about evil? And then the generic Christian, probably a Baptist, would say something like, well, free will, duh, and then that's kind of the end of it, So with many things, there's truth in everything. So there's a good way to make this argument, and it needs to be understood properly in order to use the free will defense appropriately. You got to use it. You got to understand what it is. So the basic idea is that the free will defense, well, a little bit of background, this was formulated by Alvin Plantinga, most famously, in his book called God, Freedom, and Evil. And if you remember from earlier, we're trying to find a premise in an argument that entails the existence of God and the existence of evil. So Plantinga proposes that it's something like human free will, that when God creates people with free will, he permitted the possibility of free creatures going the wrong way and doing evil. So the idea there is that God cannot actually create a free creature and then cause that person that he created to always choose the good thing. He can't cause that person to never choose evil, because then it would no longer be free. So the idea is that in all the possible worlds that God can create with free creatures, there is no feasible world wherein all of those creatures would freely choose to do the right thing all of the time. And again, you may think, well, that doesn't seem very likely. But like I said, this is a defense. So it doesn't actually have to be probable or plausible. It just has to be possible. So if it's possible that God created a world with free creatures, and if it's possible that those free creatures, that at least one free creature would choose to do something wrong one time, then it seems consistent to say that there is a world that God created and that contains evil. The beauty of this is that you don't actually have to believe in free will at all. You can be a Calvinist or a materialist determinist or what have you, as long as you are willing to affirm that free will is something that is possible, then the argument goes through. So then the upshot would be that greater good that we're trying to identify would be free will. For some reason, free will is something that is good. So perhaps it's something along the lines of true love is a great thing. True love can only happen if both parties are freely engaging in their love. So in order for there to be something good like love, there has to be a good like free will. But if there's free will, then a natural corollary to free will is that some creatures will use that free will to do something wrong, and that would be kind of the idea. So that's what the free will defense is. It's not saying that God gave us free will, so that means that everyone's going to do wrong. It says that if it's possible for God to create creatures with free will, and if it's reasonable to think that some of those creatures will go wrong, then it's logically possible that God created a world that contains evil. So there's no formal contradiction between God and evil. Are there any comments about this?
Zach, what did you think of the two-world presentation of the free will defense that I gave earlier?
What do you mean? Or could you go over that again?
Yeah, that God had to create a perfect world and an imperfect world, and in the imperfect world, it's not just free will in that model. There's also courage, self-sacrifice, and free will would be one of them. Would you think that's a good way to present the free will defense? Because then it would bring it into the equation and avoid some of the atheist objections, like free will in heaven or some of the other dumb things that they might bring up.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah, all you have to do is say that there are certain virtues in the world that are dependent on free will. Things like courage, love, were the ones that you gave. There's also another element to this called soul building. The soul building theodicy, which I think John Hick was the fellow that made this really popular. But the basic idea being that it's better to undergo moral growth. So in a world that requires you to have courage, that is something that is better. Is that kind of where you're going with that?
Yeah. So yeah, if God wants to give his creatures the maximum amount of goods, then he would have to create an imperfect world and a perfect world, so that in the imperfect world we could have things like free will.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be a little broader than the free will defense by itself, but it is essentially the same argument, just kind of broadened out.
Okay. Any further comments from patient or general?
Well, you have to show Benjamin in the broadcast.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, Benjamin joined, but I didn't actually. There we go. Hey, patient. Did you get your mic fixed?
I think so. Can you hear me?
Oh,
Am I
yeah.
coming
You
in?
sound great. Yeah, you sound great.
Well, my comment was in relation to free will. What if then you say, well, we don't truly have free will? Then what would
Yeah, so that's the beauty of this argument. Once you understand it as a defense and not a theodicy, you don't actually have to be a libertarian to use it. You don't actually have to think that there really is free will. As long as you think that free will is possible, then this argument goes through.
Zach,
But if you're,
I don't really understand that, because if you're a materialist, then you could say that you think the best stream of scientific evidence leads to the conclusion that there is no free will. So how would that even apply if you don't think that free will exists in the real world?
no, well, you would have to say, because the purpose of this is saying that, well, let me back up a little bit more. The argument is there is a formal logical contradiction between the statements God exists and evil exists. That's the argument. But the free will defense says, actually, I can give you a state of affairs. I can tell you a story that is internally consistent and contains both God and evil. And the story goes like this. God created a world with free creatures. Some of those free creatures went wrong, but free will is something that is a good that God was willing to create in the world. But a natural corollary to this good of free will is that some creatures will go the wrong way. Now, that world doesn't have to be real. That doesn't have to be the actual world. All it shows is that there's a state of affairs that's logically possible that includes God and evil, which proves that there is no formal contradiction between God and evil. That's what this argument does. So if you look at the bottom, it says that this deals with the logical problem, not necessarily the probabilistic version. So if you're a materialist, you can come back to that and say, I'll grant you that, sure, God and evil are logically consistent in the barest sense. But the story you just told is not a true story. It's not the story of the actual world. So given the evidence of the actual world, it's unlikely that God actually exists. So then you have to give then you would probably have to give another story that says, well, here's a world where there is no free will, and there is evil, and God also exists. And then that would have to be, but that would be a separate defense from the free will defense.
Well, I had something I wanted to bring up.
Oh, go ahead, patient.
Would you say that the opposite of free will is determinism?
I would say that because I'm what's called an incompatibilist, which means that I think that free will and determinism are not compatible with each other.
Yeah.
But if you're a compatibilist, like a Calvinist or actually just compatibilist,
well, no, you could be an atheist compatibilist.
Yeah. But if you believe that determinism and free will are compatible with each other, then you can have a deterministic world with free will. Yeah. But this argument in particular, I think it presupposes the libertarian view of free will.
Yeah, well, why I bring that up though is I would think if an atheist was bringing up that there wasn't any free will, then that means determinism, and then who's doing the determining? I don't
know. Yeah, I see where you're going with that. I think you could just say that. Sorry, go ahead, General.
Yeah, well, just to kind of respond to that, I think some of these titles of philosophies aren't necessarily indicative of like the doctrine. So you have to look at like a formal description of the doctrine to understand what it is, rather than just making derivations of the title, if that makes sense. So if an atheist determinist wouldn't say somebody is determining it, they would just say that it's determined by natural law or something like that.
Yeah, but
okay. I'd actually like to move on to talk. I want to bring General in on this conversation. Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about Job and the divine council, get a little bit of biblical conversation in here. So
All right, let's tag team.
Okay, so yeah, so what we've been discussing here so far has been more or less just ivory tower philosophy. But like General mentioned earlier, the Bible actually talks about this. And we have, how long is the Book of Job? Like 45 chapters or something like that. We have a 45 chapter treatise on God and evil.
I think it's 42.
Maybe, I don't know. Well, I use the Septuagint, which probably has 45. So.
No, the Septuagint ends with the resurrection.
Okay. I gotcha. Anyway, we have this treatise. Sorry, we have this treatise on God and evil in the Book of Job, and I think it would be reasonable to say a little bit about what does this have to say about the topic? Is Job even talking about the same things that we are? So. I'm kind of assuming everyone already knows the story of Job.
Yeah.
So we'll just there.
So, to be very blunt and brief, according to, if you were to read Job without the Satan figure as being the bad guy, like in this case, the devil himself, that he's actually a good angel, and Satan is a title description to mean this particular good angel. His role and his function is to be an accuser or an opposer to whatever, ex nomino, whatever the thing's happening. So Job is described as a pious man, as a man that happens to be upright. He seems to be well off, and devastating things happen to him, including the destruction of his own family. I couldn't imagine anything worse than that. But then the really, what could be for the modern mind a very uneasy perspective on why these things happen is because of a discussion that happens in the heavenly divine council. So here it's kind of like if we were scientists discussing what we should do to this ant colony. It's kind of like that, where the divine council seems to have no direct relational value of Job. It's just a oh, look at that ant down there, and look, he's the most well-off ant. You just say you're gonna, if the moment you do this to this ant, the ant will despise you, and so on. But they don't realize that as Proverbs 8 says, the man is so far below the divine that divine creature, which would be the angel, doesn't realize that in Job's context, in his own mind, he's as important as anything else, even though he's nothing. The whole dialogue takes place. Why is this happening to me? That sort of thing, and there's this discussion. But they at the same time don't realize that there's a conversation going on upstairs, and this upstairs seems to don't realize that there's a conversation going on downstairs. But the only one who is in both places at the same time is God. And curiously, I think it's in Job 15, where it's mentioned that Yahweh himself doesn't trust his own divine counsel. His literally it says that his own holy ones he doesn't trust. And in that same verse it says that the heavens are not pure. So it's kind of like this. Well, if it's happening down here, it could be happening up there as well. That sort of thing. And yeah, and I find that interesting. And then that's why you then it leads into God directly talking to Job to emphasize that he's in control. Job does get his horses back, but what still troubles me today is why didn't he give back his original family, not brand new family. And then the Septuagint mentions that in light of all of this, resurrection will happen to Job and his entire household, whole family, but his new ones as well. That's the theme of Job in a nutshell. That's probably the best, most succinct version of Job that's ever been mentioned. But yeah,
So,
go ahead. I don't know if you guys want to discuss it.
a question about that. So you're saying when it talks about Satan in Job, it's not actually talking about Satan?
Yeah, nowhere in the Old Testament is Satan speaking about the devil. That only appears,
Well,
the usage of the word appears only in the 2nd BC era, 2nd century BC.
well, then what would it be referring to it then? You said it was a good angel, but what? Like, why would they use the same word then for?
Because it's not in Hebrew grammar. If you have the definite article in front of the word, it's not a proper name. Ha-Satan is more of a description title. For example, Satan is used of Yahweh himself many times in the Old Testament. It just means to oppose. That's all it means.
To oppose? Okay.
Yes, Numbers 22, for example, when the angel of the Lord Ha-Satans the Balaam's donkey, or when Yahweh and the census with David, take your pick. And Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan," to Peter. That there's Satan there. Peter is opposing his mission. So get behind me, opposer. That's literally what it means.
So then, in that case, you don't think Peter was literally possessed either? That's another one.
No, he wasn't possessed. He's just opposing his mission, going, "This can't, God forbid, this you can't die." And very classically, he says, "Get behind me, Satan." It's not some divine being.
General, wouldn't you say though that there is a divine being called the devil in the Bible?
Yeah, I would say that originally he's called the Nakash, the Shining One.
Right.
And he's associated with, for example, the Halal Ben Shikar, the son of the dawn, or basically in Latin, Lucifer. That being always denoted with light imagery. He's definitely Satan in the ultimate sense, the opposer. He opposes everything that's good. But nowhere do you see, anywhere in Old or New Testament, the devil himself able to enter into the divine council. No longer is he's cast out.
So was he originally a member of the divine council?
Yeah, Ezekiel 28 emphasizes that point.
All right.
That it gives like a brief biography of who he was.
So the whole notion of the Church of Satan is a little misguided, then, isn't it?
The Church of Satan is misguided. What do you mean?
Well, the whole idea is that it's devoted to the devil, this being, this singular being, the devil, right? So if you're saying that we disassociate Satan with this being, then the whole church, the notion of the Church of Satan would be misguided.
No. So it their intent is to worship a particular being that opposes the gospel. So they are committing the the blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, that by default puts them into that category. I'm not at fault, or I don't commit the sin of blasphemy by saying that Yahweh is a Satan,
Right.
because I know who He is ultimately, and I'm being consistent with the fact that just the word doesn't connotate evil things. Like it's not like the devil, like the moment I write Satan, like, oh no, the devil's going to be here, sort of thing. It's just a word. It just means to oppose. That's all it is.
Yeah. Over in
The superstition arises when people only think of the devil with that word.
Yeah, yeah. Over in the States, they're a little more superstitious than we are, but yeah.
General, we're a little low on time, so is there anything in your Google Drive that you would recommend for reading about the difference between the Satan and the Nakash, or perhaps any books you might want to recommend for people interested in biblical studies?
I think probably the best book, but it's not in my Google Drive, but the best book that is out there that surveys this entire thing, and probably the first book. I think keyword here is the first book to even do that. I'm literally saying that like it's a fact. It's the first book to do it. It was published a few months ago this year, Reversing Hormone, and the subtitle is, just to show you why, like no other book even says what this says. Enoch, the Watchers, and the Forgotten Mission of Jesus. Yeah, the church, I think, I mean, this stuff was well known in the first 3 centuries, but it got lost in translation. And so, if anyone's interested on the whole, in a nutshell, what I shared about Joe, the way, this whole discussion of evil and natural disaster, and in this sense also how the divine counsel fits into that discussion. And I think that book does a lot to put your head into an ancient Israelite and how they would answer the question. Okay. Because you're going back to the original authors anyway,
Yeah.
And how would Moses answer the question, basically?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to know that's not in your Google Drive, because that would be piracy. So
yeah,
I'll put a link in the description for where to buy that book. Yeah. Patient, you had something?
So it's by. Is that who it is?
Michael Heiser is the author.
Yeah. I mean, it's a sequel to Unseen Realm. Unseen Realm is like a massive, broad brushstroke. Just, it's kind of like you need to first digest that, understand Reversing Hormone. But at the same time, if you're a sophisticated reader, I think you can skip Unseen Realm and just go straight into it.
So why then was he the first one in a long time to write about this?
Because of filters. For example, the filter that you thought that Satan and Job is the devil, that's a filter, because late church tradition taught you that, and that's not true.
Yeah. Also, I don't know that he would be the first. We also have some liberal theologians who we wouldn't consider Christians, like Elaine Pagels. She wrote this book, The Origin of Satan. She made some similar points, even though I don't know that she was so interested in establishing the ancient Near Eastern context, but it does hit on some similar themes.
What was her work dated at?
Her dated it a few years ago. You said Michael Heiser's book was published a few months ago, but I know The Origins of Satan has at least been out for a few years.
Okay, because Heiser makes a point that this book,
1995.
Oh yeah, that's outdated. This book is based on apparently the best in ancient Near Eastern studies, and that is a study that came out in 2010 So you're talking a mere 7 years ago,
Right.
where this particular guy called Anas, he basically surveyed, he went back to the drawing board and surveyed literally every single piece of cuneiform text that he could find and just reevaluate the whole divine council stuff and how they talk to each other, how they interact. And that kind of boosted Heiser to go, finally, now I can synthesize that and continue on with his book, which then he released in 2015.
Right. In addition to answering Benjamin's question of why he would be the first one, I think a big part of that could be the discoveries that have come out of the ancient Near East. And as we've learned more about it, we've been able to kind of put these things together, like the cuneiforms that Robert was talking about, that might not have been available throughout church history for us to analyze.
Yeah, they didn't even know about Ugaritic in the first century. That's why he had mistranslations of the word or, which then crept into the Quran, and on it goes.
Oh.
Okay, well, I'll go ahead and throw that in the description right now. Recommended reading.
And I think you should put Richard's blog in. I think his blog is recommended reading.
Who is Richard?
Your friend. You know, that guy that introduced you to YouTube, like.
Oh, right. The guy who introduced me to Josh Summer and Science.
Yeah.
Okay. And I'll just deal with that later. Okay. Let's go ahead and move into the wrap up now. So
wait, but wasn't there any, like, did you guys want to reflect on what I just said about Joe?
No.
Okay.
I think you said more than enough to cover anything that we had.
Was I just too like accurate with what I said, and so there's nothing to debunk?
I think it's that the conversation that we had, the subsequent conversation, led to stuff about the Satan, and so that took up a bulk of the time. So we no longer have time for the problem of evil.
Are you sure you're not the Bible thumping wingnut?
I'm sure I am.
Speaking of that, I'd like to thank our sponsor, the Bible Fun. Whatever, I'm not doing it. How much I would have to do, and I was no.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Okay, so here are our last little comments here. Like we said, evil is a problem that is something that everyone has to face. Whether you're a Christian or not, you have to address evil within your philosophical point of view and account for why it's here. And I don't know if I made it clear, but the idea behind the free will defense, behind skeptical theism, and even with the Book of Job, none of these responses, at least in my mind, are completely satisfactory. I honestly do not think that after reading Job and after thinking through the ideas of skeptical theism, and even after reading Planet Against God, Freedom and Evil, I've never actually personally settled on something that I find completely consistent and has answered all of my questions about why there's evil in the world or anything like that. But I do think we have a handful of pretty good intuitions. We also have a couple of limitations for us. Even God himself in the Book of Job asking, where were you, Job, when I laid the foundations of the world? I think that those elements can get us close to an answer, at least a partial solution to the problem, but I don't think we'll ever have a full one. But honestly, I think that at least having these intuitions and having a partial promising solution is something that's better than no solution at all, rather than throwing our hands up in the air and just saying, well, we just accept it on faith, kind of a thing. But ultimately, I think that even if we don't understand why God allows evil to exist, we should definitely remember that he chose to take on humanity and experience evil with us. And I think that right there is the kernel of whatever Christian response that we develop for the problem of evil. I think that this right here is probably the most promising element and the most unique element that specifically Christians can bring to the table. Jesus, or God himself, became flesh and experienced all of the pains and all the trials that we have here on earth. So we don't have some sort of distant God that is that can't relate to what we're doing. Even like what General was saying earlier, that even in the Old Testament, where things may appear to be like like looking down on ants in a maze or something like that, the Christian hope is grounded in the fact that ultimately God did in fact become a human being and did in fact experience everything that we have. So we do not have, as it says in Hebrews, we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with us because he experienced the pain that we have. And I think that ultimately whatever we do has to be grounded, or whatever answer we provide is ultimately going to point back to that fundamental reality. So I don't have anything else to say. Would anyone like to give any closing remarks?
Yeah.
Amen.
I think that the Christian worldview resolves the problem of evil, because we know that at the cross Christ defeated death, and at the end of the ages there will be an ultimate solution to evil, that God will give us a new heaven and a new earth with give it to his creatures with no death or suffering or sin, and will have this. The saints will inherit, the meek will inherit the earth without any of those blemishes. So the Christian solution to the problem of evil, I think, is the most promising and the most hopeful.
Yeah, actually, yeah. On a serious note, that's actually a good point, because as I mentioned earlier about the whole anxiety thing on true randomness that happens in this world and so on. Fact is, Jesus won, and the resurrection happened, and therefore, 1 Corinthians 15, if the resurrection did not happen, we would be the most miserable people on the planet. So, in a way, why should we worry, really? Yes, there is a thing called death. Yes, these things happen. It could happen to me. God forbid it happens to any of you. But the point is, isn't it a wonder then that Christians for the last 2,000 years have always had that anchor of faith, an unusual strength in light of the unknown. That valley of deep darkness, that all that language, basically Psalm 23, in light of Jesus.
Right.
So yeah, that'll be my ending point.
Okay. Patient, you have anything to add?
Yeah, well, basically, I just want to say, sort of in agreement with that I do think Christianity sort of resolves it. If you said there may be some things that are not 100% resolved, but I think it does it better than anything else, really.
Yeah, one thing that I didn't get into, there are some people that suggest you can actually flip the problem of evil around into something a lot like the moral argument. Some people would say that if you say that morality or objective morality can only be grounded in the existence of God, then by admitting that there's evil in the world, you are admitting that there is some sort of objective morality in the world. There's a little bit of there's some fruit there. I think there's a promising direction you can go insofar as you think the moral arguments are successful. So I think that's good. Anyway, guys, thanks again for being here for this RC stream. If you want to find out more about Ratio Christi at Texas A&M, you can go to rc-tamu.org. Or you can check out more of our content at thinktheism.org. That's where we put a lot of our audio lectures, some of our meetings, as well as special podcast episodes. Now for the closing credits. Ratio Christi at Texas A&M live stream is sponsored by Ratio Christi National, which you can find at ratiochristi.org. This particular stream is sponsored by the General Han Solo YouTube channel, which you can find at youtube.com/General Han Solo. We're also sponsored by several eminent blogs, including thereforegodexists.com, which is run by Richard Bushy. We're also sponsored by caplawson.wordpress.com, which has an Alexa rating of over 6 million, which is incredible. It's very difficult to get numbers that high. We're also sponsored by thoughtsinthecar.blogspot.com, the latest in apologetics blogging out there. Probably the only deconstructionist, Dadaist, absurdist apologist I've ever seen before. We're sponsored by the Facebook group Protestant Cafe, which you can join if you are a Protestant. We are also sponsored by several members of the Great Debate Community, which you can find at greatdebatecommunity.com, who is also run by Steve McCrae, which you can find there. We are also sponsored by Luis de Molina, which you can find at twitter.com/Luis de Molina. We're also sponsored by Sinners in the Hands of an Angryblog.com, which is run by Tony Lee Ross. You can find his thoughts there. And lastly, we are sponsored by the eminent defender on the internet, the man that many of us know too well. He's anonymous, but sometimes, just like Batman, all of our heroes are anonymous. He simply goes by the moniker DN42069, and we would like to give a shout out to him. So I think that's all the shouts out that I've got for today. We'll see you next time on the Ratio Christi broadcast.